They said Margarette Cole could break any horse alive. They said it with fear, sometimes with disbelief, but never with kindness. Margarette didn't care. Horses didn't care either. They responded to what was real, not what was said. The gray Mustang in the corral proved the point. He reared, hooves slashing the air, eyes rolling white as the gathered ranch hands stepped back. He was all muscle and terror, scarred flanks twitching beneath a coat dulled by dust and neglect. He'd thrown 2 men already. One had sworn the horse was cursed. Margarette tightened the rawhide gloves around her hands and stepped inside the fence. "Easy, boy," she murmured, not soft, not loud, honest. The Mustang snorted and charged. The men watching held their breath. Margarette didn't flinch. She moved with him, not against him, turning at the last second. Dust spiraling as she placed herself just outside his strike. Her eyes stayed locked on his knot, challenging, not submissive, present. Minutes stretched. Sweat ran down her spine beneath her worn shirt. The horse slowed, confused by the lack of pain, the lack of force. When she finally laid a hand against his neck, it wasn't victory, it was permission. By the time the sun dipped low, the Mustang stood trembling, but still. Margarette's forehead pressed against his, her breath matching his own. "That's witchcraft," someone muttered. Margarette swung down from the fence, ignoring the stares. "It's patience," she said. "Something you'd learn if you listened more than you shouted." She didn't stay to argue. She never did. Across the yard, Daniel Harper watched quietly. He'd arrived that morning with his black medical case and his calm, observant eyes, sent by the county to check on livestock health after rumors of sickness spread through the region. He wasn't a ranch man, not in the way these men were. His clothes were neat, his voice measured, his hands careful. And yet, he'd seen something in that corral that unsettled him. Not domination, understanding. Later, as Margarette rinsed her hands at the pump, she sensed someone behind her. She turned, water dripping from her fingers. "You're the veterinarian," she said flatly. Daniel smiled faintly. "And you're Margarette Cole." "I don't give autographs." "I didn't ask for one." That earned him a glance. Most men bristled or postured. This one simply stood there, as if waiting was his natural state. "I wanted to thank you," he said. That horse would have been ruined if they'd kept trying to beat him into obedience. Her eyes narrowed. "You think I didn't beat him?" "No," Daniel replied. "I think you listened." The words landed deeper than she expected. Margarette turned back to the pump. "Listening gets you hurt." "So does force," he said gently, just in louder ways. She studied him, now really studied him. There was strength in him, but it was quiet, coiled beneath restraint. The kind of man who didn't rush to fill silence because he respected it. "What are you doing here, Doc?" she asked. "Trying to help animals that can't explain their pain," Daniel said. Then, after a pause, "And people, if they'll let me." She snorted. "Good luck with that." As she walked past him, dust swirling around her boots, Daniel felt something shift. He had spent his life believing healing required gentleness, above all else. Margarette Cole was proof that gentleness sometimes wore calloused hands. And Margarette, mounting her horse and riding out toward the fading sun, couldn't explain why the quiet veterinarian's eyes stayed with her long after she was gone. But the wildest things, she knew, always noticed when someone saw them clearly. Daniel Harper had learned early that animals spoke more truth than people. A horse's limp, a cow's labored breath, these were honest things. People, on the other hand, hid pain behind pride or anger or silence. That was why Daniel preferred barns to parlors, why he chose listening over lecturing. It was also why Margarette Cole unsettled him. She unsettled the entire ranch. The next morning, Daniel found her in the far pasture, working with a chestnut mare tied loosely to a post. The horse tossed her head, eyes sharp with distrust. Margarette stood close, hands resting lightly on the rope, not pulling, not yielding. "You're crowding her," Daniel said before he could stop himself. Margarette didn't turn. "And you're interrupting." Daniel cleared his throat. Her left hind is favoring, she's anticipating pain. If you push too fast, she won't trust me, Margarette finished calmly. I know. She loosened the rope, instead of tightening it, stepping back a pace. The mare blinked, startled, then stilled. Daniel frowned. You adjusted. Listen, Margarette said, echoing his words from the day before. Just not the way you do. That earned him a small smile. They worked in silence for a while. Daniel observing, Margarette moving with careful authority. She corrected without punishing, demanded without cruelty. It went against everything Daniel had been taught about breaking wild horses and yet, it worked. When the mare finally relaxed, Daniel approached. She needs rest, he said, and time. Margarette wiped sweat from her brow. Time's a luxury ranchers don't like paying for. Neither do bodies, Daniel replied. Animal or human. She studied him again. Sharper this time. You always talk like that. Only when it's true. Something flickered in her expression. Approval, maybe. Later that afternoon, Daniel treated a sick calf, while Margarette watched from the fence. She noticed how steady his hands were, how softly he spoke, even when the animal kicked in fear. You don't force them, she said. I don't believe fear teaches anything worth learning, Daniel replied. That struck something raw in her chest. She'd learned early that fear was the only language some people spoke. That pain demanded respect. That softness got you trampled. And yet here was a man who stood firm, without raising his voice. That night, a storm rolled in fast. Thunder cracked overhead as Daniel finished his rounds, rain soaking his coat. When lightning spooked a group of newly penned horses, chaos followed screams. Snapping boards, hooves pounding against wood. Margarette was already moving. She ran straight into the fray, cutting ropes, guiding horses through the confusion with sharp calls and fearless presence. Daniel followed, heart pounding, trying to steady animals where he could. One horse reared suddenly, panicked and blind with fear. Margarette, Daniel shouted. She turned too late. The horse struck the fence hard, splintering wood. Margarette was thrown backward, hitting the ground with a dull, breath-stealing thud. Daniel was at her side instantly. Don't move, he said, voice calm but urgent. She winced. I've had worse. I don't doubt it, he said, checking her ribs carefully. But that doesn't mean you ignore this. Rain soaked them both, as thunder rolled again. For a moment, Margarette let him take control. Let him guide her breathing. Let him steady her shaking hands. It frightened her. How easily she allowed it. You're not invincible, Daniel said quietly. She met his gaze, rain tracing paths down her face. Neither are you. A beat passed. Something unspoken settled between them, respect, concern, something closer to tenderness than either was ready to name. When the storm finally broke, Margarette stood on her own again, pulling away gently. Don't mistake this, she said. I don't need saving. Daniel nodded. I know. But as he watched her walk back into the night, soaked and stubborn and strong, he realized something dangerous. He didn't want to save her. He wanted to understand her. And Margarette, bruised and restless, lay awake later wondering why gentleness suddenly felt like the bravest thing she'd ever seen. Margarette's body ached in the quiet hours before dawn. She rose anyway. Pain was an old companion one. She trusted more than comfort. She saddled her horse and rode out before the ranch stirred, needing space where memories couldn't corner her. But the past had long legs. She dismounted near the ridge where the land dipped into open wild, letting the wind tear through her hair. It reminded her of another time, another horse, another man, shouting instead of listening. She'd been younger then, quicker to prove herself, desperate to survive. The memory came uninvited, the crack of a whip, the smell of blood, the sound of a frightened horse breaking wrong because fear had been mistaken for strength. She swallowed hard. Margarette. Daniel's voice reached her, soft but surprised. She turned sharply. You shouldn't be here. I could say the same, he replied, stopping a respectful distance away. He noticed the tension immediately, the rigid shoulders, the faraway look. He didn't press. Instead, he waited. That alone unraveled her. I learned early that force gets results, she said suddenly. That's what they taught me. Men who didn't care if horses or people broke, as long as they obeyed. Daniel listened, heart heavy. And you chose a different way. She shook her head. I didn't choose. I survived. There's a difference. He nodded. Survival leaves marks. She glanced at him, surprised. You talk like someone who knows. Daniel hesitated, then opened his medical case. Not for tools, but for honesty. I used to think gentleness was weakness, he admitted. My father didn't. He believed pain built character. Margarette said nothing, but she listened. He pushed until something in me folded. Daniel continued. I learned that healing wasn't about enduring hurt. It was about stopping it. The wind moved between them, carrying unspoken understanding. Later that day, Daniel treated the gray Mustang Margarette had broken days earlier. The horse stood quietly now, eyes alert but calm. Margarette watched from the fence. He's healing fast, Daniel said. Because you didn't take more than he could give. She shrugged. Some wounds don't show. Most don't, Daniel replied. That night, they shared a simple meal by the barn, coffee, bread, silence. It wasn't awkward. It felt earned. Margarette found herself watching Daniel when he laughed softly at something she said. Surprised by how rare the sound was, and how much she wanted to hear it again. Do you ever think about leaving this place? She asked. Sometimes, Daniel said. But then, I remember why I stay. She waited. Because wild things deserve patience, he finished, glancing at her. Her chest tightened. She stood abruptly. Don't start seeing me like that. Like what? Something that needs fixing. Daniel rose slowly. I don't want to fix you. She searched his face, suspicious and vulnerable, all at once. Then what do you want? He met her gaze, steady and honest. To walk beside you, if you'll let me. The simplicity of it scared her more than any storm or stallion ever had. She turned away before he could see how close she was to believing him. But that night, as Margarette lay listening to the horses breathe in the dark, she realized something had shifted. For scars had been seen, and instead of being used against her, they had been understood. The accident happened without warning. A young ranch hand rushed into the yard just after noon, panic cracking his voice. The bay gelding he bolted, took Miss Turner with him, toward the ravine. Margarette was moving before the sentence finished. Daniel followed. They found the horse, tangled near the ravine's edge, breath coming hard, eyes wild. Miss Turner lay nearby, conscious but badly shaken, her leg twisted at an angle that made Daniel's stomach tighten. Margarette approached the gelding first, slow and deliberate, murmuring low. The horse trembled, muscles tight with fear and pain. One wrong move, and he'd plunge over the edge. Daniel knelt beside the injured woman, voice calm as he assessed the damage. You're going to be all right, he said gently. I need you to breathe with me. Margarette worked the horse with infinite patience, hands steady despite the danger. Daniel watched her from the corner of his eye. Struck by the balance, she held strength wrapped around care, fear mastered by purpose. The gelding finally stilled. Only then did Margarette's hands shake. Daniel noticed. Later, after Miss Turner was safely transported back to the ranch, Daniel found Margarette alone by the ravine, staring into the drop. He could have been killed, he said quietly. So could she, Margarette replied. That's the job. No, Daniel said. That's the habit. She turned sharply. You think I don't know the risks. I think you carry them alone, he answered. Silence fell heavy. I can't afford softness, Margarette said. Every time I let my guard down, something breaks. Daniel stepped closer, not invading, just present. Soft doesn't mean weak. It means responsive. Her voice wavered despite herself. You don't understand what it costs. I understand more than you think, he said. And I'm still here. That did it. Margarette's composure cracked. Just slightly. Enough. You make this harder, she said, eyes bright. Caring makes things dangerous. Daniel nodded. So does not caring. It just hurts. Slower. They stood close now, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. Margarette looked at him like a woman standing at the edge of unfamiliar ground. "What if I can't be gentle?" she whispered. Daniel reached out, stopping just short of touching her. "Then I'll meet you where you are." The choice hovered. They're terrifying, tempting. Margarette closed the distance herself. The kiss was quiet. No urgency, no claiming, just recognition. Daniel's hand rested at her back, steady and sure, as if anchoring something long, untethered. When they parted, Margarette rested her forehead against his. "This doesn't change who I am." "I hope not," Daniel said softly. "I like who you are." That night, the ranch slept easier. Horses rested, wounds were bound. And in the stillness, Margarette allowed herself something radical, hope. But the wild never rested long, and tomorrow would demand a final choice. The wild horse came in at sunrise. He was bigger than the others, darker, scarred along the flank, eyes burning with memory and defiance. No one knew where he'd come from. No one knew that he'd crashed through the outer fence like a storm, given flesh. The ranch hands backed away. Margarette didn't. She approached slowly, heart steady, though her mind wasn't. This horse wasn't just dangerous, he was familiar. Not in body, but in spirit. A creature shaped by force, surviving despite it. Daniel stood nearby, quiet as always. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. Margarette paused. For the first time in her life, she didn't answer immediately. "Stay," she said finally. Daniel did. Together they worked Margarette, reading the horse's movements. Daniel, watching for signs of pain beneath the fury. When the horse struck out, Margarette didn't retaliate. When he faltered, Daniel spoke softly, grounding both animal and woman. Hours passed. The horse broke not in fear, but in release. His head lowered, his breath slowed. The wildness didn't vanish. It settled. Margarette rested her hand against his neck. Tears, she didn't bother hiding, tracing clean paths through dust. Daniel stepped beside her. "You didn't conquer him." "No," she said. "I listened." She turned to Daniel, then really seeing him not as a risk, not as a weakness, but as a partner. "I spent my life proving I could survive," she said. "I don't want to do that alone anymore." Daniel took her hand, warm and steady. "Then don't." The ranch changed after that. Margarette trained horses differently, still strong, still fearless, but no longer closed off. Daniel built a small clinic beside the barn, tending animals and people alike. Ranch hands learned that power didn't have to be loud to be respected. At dusk, Margarette and Daniel often walked the pastures together, the sound of hooves and wind their constant companions. "You still wild?" Daniel asked once. Margarette smiled. "Always." "Good," he said. "So am I." And in a land that once believed only force could tame, they proved something truer. Even the wildest souls deserve gentleness. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.